Good morning. Everybody, please have a seat. Of the many powers and responsibilities that the Constitution vests in the presidency, few are more consequential than appointing a Supreme Court justice, particularly one to succeed Justice Scalia, one of the most influential jurists of our time. The men and women who sit on the Supreme Court are the final arbiters of American law. They safeguard our rights. They ensure that our system is one of laws and not men. They're charged with the essential task of applying principles put to paper more than 2 centuries ago to some of the most challenging questions of our time. So this is not a responsibility that I take lightly. It's a decision that requires me to set aside short-term expediency and narrow politics so as to maintain faith with our founders and perhaps more importantly with future generations. And that's why over the past several weeks I've done my best to set up a rigorous and comprehensive process. I've sought the advice of Republican and Democratic members of Congress. We've reached out to every member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to constitutional scholars, to advocacy groups, to bar associations representing an array of interests and opinions from all across the spectrum. And today, after completing this exhaustive process, I've made my decision. I've selected a nominee who is widely recognized not only as one of America's sharpest legal minds, but someone who brings to his work a spirit of decency, modesty, integrity, even-handedness, and excellence. These qualities and his long commitment to public service have earned him the respect and admiration of leaders from both sides of the aisle. He will ultimately bring that same character to bear on the Supreme Court, an institution in which he is uniquely prepared to serve immediately. Today I am nominating Chief Judge Merrick Brian Garland to join the Supreme Court. Now, in law enforcement circles and in the legal community at large, Judge Garland needs no introduction. But I'd like to take a minute to introduce Merrick to the American people, whom he already so ably serves. He was born and raised in the land of Lincoln, in my hometown of Chicago, in my home state of Illinois. His mother volunteered in the community. His father ran a small business out of their home. Inheriting that work ethic, Merrick became valedictorian of his public high school. He earned a scholarship to Harvard, where he graduated summa cum laude. And he put himself through Harvard Law School by working as a tutor, by stocking shoes in a shoe store, and in what is always a painful moment for any young man, by selling his comic book collection. It's tough. Been there. Merrick graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law, and the early years of his legal career bear all the traditional marks of excellence. He clerked for 2 of President Eisenhower's judicial appointees, first for a legendary judge on the Second Circuit, Judge Henry Friendly, and then for Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. Following his clerkships, Merrick joined a highly regarded law firm with a practice focused on litigation and pro bono representation of disadvantaged Americans. Within 4 years, he earned a partnership, the dream of most lawyers. But in 1989, just months after that achievement, Merrick made a highly unusual career decision. He walked away from a comfortable and lucrative law practice to return to public service. Merrick accepted a low-level job as a federal prosecutor in President George H.W. Bush's administration, took a 50% pay cut, traded in his elegant partner's office for a windowless closet that smelled of stale cigarette smoke. This was a time when crime here in Washington had reached epidemic proportions, and he wanted to help. And he quickly made a name for himself going after corrupt politicians and violent criminals. His sterling record as a prosecutor led him to the Justice Department, where he oversaw some of the most significant prosecutions in the 1990s, including overseeing every aspect of the federal response to the Oklahoma City bombing. In the aftermath of that act of terror, when 168 people, many of them small children, were murdered, Merrick had one evening to say goodbye to his own young daughters before he boarded a plane to Oklahoma City, and he would remain there for weeks. He worked side by side with first responders, rescue workers, local and federal law enforcement. He led the investigation and supervised the prosecution that brought Timothy McVeigh to justice. But perhaps most important is the way he did it. Throughout the process, Merrick took pains to do everything by the book. When people offered to turn over evidence voluntarily, he refused, taking the harder route of obtaining the proper subpoenas instead, because Merrick would take no chances that someone who murdered innocent Americans might go free on a technicality. Merrick also made a concerted effort to reach out to the victims and their families, updating them frequently on the case's progress. Everywhere he went, he carried with him in his briefcase the program from the memorial service with each of the victims' names inside, a constant searing reminder of why he had to succeed. Judge Garland has often referred to his work on the Oklahoma City case as, and I quote, "the most important thing I have ever done in my life." And through it all, he never lost touch with that community that he served. It's no surprise then that soon after his work in Oklahoma City, Merrick was nominated to what's often called the second highest court in the land, the D.C. Circuit Court. During that process, during that confirmation process, he earned overwhelming bipartisan praise from senators and legal experts alike. Republican Senator Orrin Hatch, who was then chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, supported his nomination. Back then he said, "In all honesty, I would like to see one person come to this floor and say one reason why Merrick Garland does not deserve this position." He actually accused fellow Senate Republicans trying to obstruct Merrick's confirmation of playing politics with judges. And he has since said that Judge Garland would be a consensus nominee for the Supreme Court, who would be very well supported by all sides, and there would be no question Merrick would be confirmed with bipartisan support. Now, ultimately, Merrick was confirmed to the D.C. Circuit, the second highest court in the land, with votes from a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans. 3 years ago, he was elevated to Chief Judge. And in his 19 years on the D.C. Circuit, Judge Garland has brought his trademark diligence, compassion, and unwavering regard for the rule of law to his work. On a circuit court known for strong-minded judges on both ends of the spectrum, Judge Garland has earned a track record of building consensus as a thoughtful, fair-minded judge who follows the law. He's shown a rare ability to bring together odd couples, assemble unlikely coalitions, persuade colleagues with wide-ranging judicial philosophies to sign on to his opinions. And this record on the bench speaks, I believe, to Judge Garland's fundamental temperament, his insistence that all views deserve a respectful hearing. His habit, to borrow a phrase from former Justice John Paul Stevens, of understanding before disagreeing, and then disagreeing without being disagreeable. It speaks to his ability to persuade, to respond to the concerns of others with sound arguments and airtight logic. As his former colleague on the D.C. Circuit and our current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, once said, Anytime Judge Garland disagrees, you know you're in a difficult area. At the same time, Chief Judge Garland is more than just a brilliant legal mind. He's someone who has a keen understanding that justice is about more than abstract legal theory, more than some footnote in a dusty casebook. His life experience, his experience in places like Oklahoma City, informs his view that the law is more than an intellectual exercise. He understands the way law affects the daily reality of people's lives in a big, complicated democracy and in rapidly changing times. And throughout his jurisprudence runs a common thread, a dedication to protecting the basic rights of every American, a conviction that in a democracy, powerful voices must not be allowed to drown out the voices of everyday Americans. To find someone with such a long career of public service, marked by complex and sensitive issues, to find someone who just about everyone not only respects but genuinely likes, that is rare. And it speaks to who Merrick Garland is, not just as a lawyer, but as a man. People respect the way he treats others, his genuine courtesy and respect for his colleagues and those who come before his court. They admire his civic-mindedness, mentoring his clerks throughout their careers, urging them to use their legal training to serve their communities, setting his own example by tutoring a young student at a Northeast DC elementary school each year for the past 18 years. They're moved by his deep devotion to his family. Lynn, his wife of nearly 30 years, and their two daughters, Becky and Jessie. As a family, they indulge their love of hiking and skiing and canoeing and their love of America by visiting our national parks. People respect Merrick's deep and abiding passion for protecting our most basic constitutional rights. It's a passion, I'm told, that manifested itself at an early age. And one story is indicative of this. It's notable. As valedictorian of his high school class, he had to deliver a commencement address. The other student speaker that day spoke first and unleashed a fiery critique of the Vietnam War. Fearing the controversy that might result, several parents decided to unplug the sound system, and the rest of the student's speech was muffled. And Merrick didn't necessarily agree with the tone of his classmates' remarks, nor his choice of topic for that day, but stirred by the sight of a fellow student's voice being silenced, he tossed aside his prepared remarks and delivered instead, on the spot, a passionate, impromptu defense of our First Amendment rights. It was the beginning of a lifelong career as a lawyer and a prosecutor and as a judge devoted to protecting the rights of others. And he has done that work with decency and humanity and common sense and a common touch. And I'm proud that he'll continue that work on our nation's highest court. I said I would take this process seriously, and I did. I chose a serious man and an exemplary judge, Merrick Garland. Over my 7 years as president, in all my conversations with senators from both parties, in which I asked their views on qualified Supreme Court nominees, and this includes the previous 2 seats that I had to fill, the one name that has come up repeatedly from Republicans and Democrats alike is Merrick Garland. Now, I recognize that we have entered the political season, or perhaps these days it never ends. A political season that is even noisier and more volatile than usual. I know that Republicans will point to Democrats who've made it hard for Republican presidents to get their nominees confirmed. And they're not wrong about that. There's been politics involved in nominations in the past, although it should be pointed out that in each of those instances, Democrats ultimately confirmed a nominee put forward by a Republican president. I also know that because of Justice Scalia's outsized role on the court and in American law, and the fact that Americans are closely divided on a number of issues before the court, it is tempting to make this confirmation process simply an extension of our divided politics, the squabbling that's going on in the news every day. But to go down that path would be wrong. It would be a betrayal of our best traditions and a betrayal of the vision of our founding documents. At a time when our politics are so polarized, at a time when norms and customs of political rhetoric and courtesy and comedy are so often treated like they're disposable, this is precisely the time when we should play it straight and treat the process of appointing a Supreme Court justice with the seriousness and care it deserves. Because our Supreme Court really is unique. It's supposed to be above politics. It has to be, and it should stay that way. To suggest that someone as qualified and respected as Merrick Garland doesn't even deserve a hearing, let alone an up or down vote, to join an institution as important as our Supreme Court, when 2/3 of Americans believe otherwise, that would be unprecedented. To suggest that someone who has served his country with honor and dignity, with a distinguished track record of delivering justice for the American people, might be treated, as one Republican leader stated, as a political piñata, that can't be right. Tomorrow, Judge Garland will travel to the Hill to begin meeting with senators one-on-one. I simply ask Republicans in the Senate to give him a fair hearing, and then an up or down vote. If you don't, then it will not only be an abdication of the Senate's constitutional duty, it will indicate a process for nominating and confirming judges that is beyond repair. It will mean everything is subject to the most partisan of politics, everything. It will provoke an endless cycle of more tit for tat and make it increasingly possible for any president, Democrat or Republican, to carry out their constitutional function. The reputation of the Supreme Court will inevitably suffer. Faith in our justice system will inevitably suffer. And our democracy will ultimately suffer as well. I have fulfilled my constitutional duty. Now it's time for the Senate to do theirs. Presidents do not stop working in the final year of their term. Neither should a senator. I know that tomorrow the Senate will take a break and leave town on recess for 2 weeks. My earnest hope is that senators take that time to reflect on the importance of this process to our democracy. Not what's expedient, not what's happening at the moment. What does this mean for our institutions, for our common life? The stakes, the consequences, the seriousness of the job we all swore an oath to do. And when they return, I hope that they'll act in a bipartisan fashion. I hope they're fair. That's all. I hope they are fair, as they did when they confirmed Merrick Garland to the D.C. Circuit. I ask that they confirm Merrick Garland now to the Supreme Court, so that he can take his seat in time to fully participate in its work for the American people this fall. He is the right man for the job. He deserves to be confirmed. I could not be prouder of the work that he has already done on behalf of the American people. He deserves our thanks, and he deserves a fair hearing. And with that, I'd like to invite Judge Garland to say a few words. Thank you.
You're good, man.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is the greatest honor of my life, other than Lynn agreeing to marry me 28 years ago. It's also the greatest gift I've ever received, except, and there's another caveat, the birth of our daughters, Jessie and Becky. As my parents taught me, by both words and deeds, a life of public service is as much a gift to the person who serves as it is to those he is serving. And for me, there could be no higher public service than serving as a member of the United States Supreme Court. My family deserves much of the credit for the path that led me here. My grandparents left the Pale of Settlement at the border of Western Russia and Eastern Europe in the early 1900s, fleeing anti-Semitism and hoping to make a better life for their children in America. They settled in the Midwest, eventually making their way to Chicago. There, my father, who ran the smallest of small businesses from a room in our basement, took me with him as he made the rounds to his customers, always impressing upon me the importance of hard work and fair dealing. There, my mother headed the local PTA and school board and directed a volunteer services agency, all the while instilling in my sisters and me the understanding that service to the community is a responsibility above all others. Even now, my sisters honor that example by serving the children of their communities. I know that my mother is watching this on television and crying her eyes out. So are my sisters, who have supported me in every step I have ever taken. I only wish that my father were here to see this today. I also wish that we hadn't taught my older daughter to be so adventurous that she would be hiking in the mountains out of cell service range when the president called. It was the sense of responsibility to serve the community, instilled by my parents, that led me to leave my law firm to become a line prosecutor in 1989. There, one of my first assignments was to assist in the prosecution of a violent gang that had come down to the district from New York, took over a public housing project, and terrorized the residents. The hardest job we faced was persuading mothers and grandmothers that if they testified, we would be able to keep them safe and convict the gang members. We succeeded only by convincing witnesses and victims that they could trust that the rule of law would prevail. Years later, when I went to Oklahoma City to investigate the bombing of the Federal Building, I saw up close the devastation that can happen when someone abandons the justice system as a way of resolving grievances and instead takes matters into his own hands. Once again, I saw the importance of assuring victims and families that the justice system could work. We promised that we would find the perpetrators, that we would bring them to justice, and that we would do it in a way that honored the Constitution. The people of Oklahoma City gave us their trust, and we did everything we could to live up to it. Trust that justice will be done in our courts without prejudice or partisanship is what, in a large part, distinguishes this country from others. People must be confident that a judge's decisions are determined by the law and only the law. For a judge to be worthy of such trust, he or she must be faithful to the Constitution and to the statutes passed by the Congress. He or she must put aside his personal views or preferences and follow the law, not make it. Fidelity to the Constitution and the law has been the cornerstone of my professional life, and it is the hallmark of the kind of judge I have tried to be for the past 18 years. If the Senate sees fit to confirm me to the position for which I have been nominated today, I promise to continue on that course. Mr. President, it's a great privilege to be nominated by a fellow Chicagoan. I am grateful beyond words for the honor you have bestowed upon me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations, man. Good job. Good job.
Buenas tardes. Señor Presidente Barack Obama, nos complace recibirlo en la primera visita de un mandatario de los Estados Unidos a nuestro país después de 88 años. Constatamos que en los 15 meses transcurridos, desde que anunciamos la decisión de restablecer las relaciones diplomáticas, hemos obtenido resultados concretos. Reanudamos el correo postal directo y firmamos un acuerdo para restablecer los vuelos regulares. Hemos ampliado la cooperación en áreas de interés mutuo. Suscribimos 2 memorándums de entendimiento sobre protección de medio ambiente y áreas marinas y otro para mejorar la seguridad de la navegación marítima. Hoy se firmará uno más sobre cooperación en la agricultura. Actualmente se está negociando otro grupo de instrumentos bilaterales para cooperar en esferas como el enfrentamiento al narcotráfico, la seguridad del comercio y de los viajeros y la salud. Sobre esta última, hemos acordado profundizar la colaboración en la prevención y tratamiento de enfermedades transmisibles como el Zika y de enfermedades crónicas no transmisibles, incluyendo el cáncer. Esta cooperación es beneficiosa no solo para Cuba y los Estados Unidos, sino también para nuestro hemisferio. A partir de las decisiones adoptadas por el presidente Obama para modificar la aplicación de algunos aspectos del bloqueo, empresas cubanas y sus contrapartes estadounidenses trabajan en la identificación de posibles operaciones comerciales que se pudieran concretar en el marco aún restrictivo de las regulaciones en vigor. Algunas se han materializado especialmente en el área de las telecomunicaciones, ámbito en el que nuestro país cuenta con un programa basado en sus prioridades de desarrollo y en la necesaria soberanía tecnológica que garantiza el uso apropiado de estas al servicio de los intereses nacionales. También se avanza en negociaciones para la adquisición de medicamentos, equipos médicos y equipamiento para generación de energía y protección del medio ambiente, entre otras. Mucho más pudiera hacerse si se levantara el bloqueo de los Estados Unidos. Reconocemos la posición del presidente Obama y de su gobierno contra el bloqueo y los reiterados llamados que ha hecho al Congreso para que lo elimine. Las últimas medidas adoptadas por su gobierno son positivas, pero no suficientes. Intercambié con el presidente sobre otras medidas que pensamos pueden tomarse para eliminar restricciones aún vigentes y hacer una importante contribución al desmantelamiento del bloqueo. Esto es esencial porque el bloqueo continúa en vigor y tiene componentes disuasivos y efectos intimidatorios de alcance extraterritorial, sobre lo cual le puse algunos ejemplos al presidente para mostrarle sus consecuencias negativas para Cuba y otros estados. El bloqueo es el obstáculo más importante para nuestro desarrollo económico y el bienestar del pueblo cubano. Por eso, su eliminación será esencial para normalizar las relaciones bilaterales. También será beneficioso para la emigración cubana que desea lo mejor para sus familias y su país. Para avanzar hacia la normalización, también será necesario que se devuelva el territorio ilegalmente ocupado por la base naval de Guantánamo. Ambos temas, por ser los principales obstáculos, fueron abordados una vez más en el editorial publicado el 9 de marzo pasado en el órgano oficial del Partido Comunista de Cuba y hace solo 4 días en la conferencia de prensa de nuestro canciller Bruno Rodríguez Parrilla, ampliamente divulgado por la prensa. Asimismo, otras políticas debieran ser suprimidas para que pueda haber relaciones normales entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos. No debiera pretenderse para ello que el pueblo cubano renuncie al destino que libre y soberanamente ha escogido y por el que ha hecho inmensos sacrificios. Intercambiamos además sobre temas internacionales, en particular aquellos que pudieran afectar la paz y la estabilidad regional. Especialmente estaba previsto y no hubo tiempo para concluirlo, era abordar nuestra preocupación por la situación de desestabilización que se intenta fomentar en Venezuela, lo cual es contraproducente para el ambiente en el continente, pero lo expreso en esta ocasión. Igualmente, dialogamos sobre la marcha del proceso de paz en Colombia y los esfuerzos para poner fin a este conflicto. Existen profundas diferencias entre nuestros países que no van a desaparecer, pues tenemos concepciones distintas sobre muchos temas, como los modelos políticos, la democracia, el ejercicio de los derechos humanos, la justicia social, las relaciones internacionales, la paz y la estabilidad mundial. Defendemos los derechos humanos. Consideramos que los derechos civiles, políticos, económicos, sociales y culturales son indivisibles, interdependientes y universales. No concebimos que un gobierno no defienda y garantice el derecho a la salud, la educación, la seguridad social, a la alimentación y al desarrollo, el salario igual por trabajo igual y los derechos de los niños. Nos oponemos a la manipulación política y el doble rasero sobre los derechos humanos. Cuba tiene mucho que decir y que mostrar en esta materia y por ello le reiteré al presidente nuestra disposición a mantener el diálogo que iniciamos. El pasado 17 de diciembre del 2014, cuando anunciamos la decisión de restablecer las relaciones diplomáticas, expresé: debemos aprender el arte de convivir de forma civilizada con nuestras diferencias. El 15 de julio del 2015, ante nuestro Parlamento, señalé: cambiar todo lo que deba ser cambiado es asunto soberano y exclusivo de los cubanos. El gobierno revolucionario tiene la disposición de avanzar en la normalización de las relaciones, convencido de que ambos países podemos cooperar y coexistir civilizadamente en beneficio mutuo, por encima de las diferencias que tenemos y seguramente tendremos, y contribuir con ello a la paz, la seguridad, la estabilidad, el desarrollo y la equidad en nuestro continente y el mundo. Hoy ratifico que debemos poner en práctica el arte de la convivencia civilizada, que implica aceptar y respetar las diferencias y no hacer de ellas el centro de nuestra relación, sino promover vínculos que privilegien el beneficio de ambos países y pueblos y concentrarnos en lo que nos acerca y no en lo que nos separa. Coincidimos en que nos queda por delante un largo y complejo camino por recorrer, pero lo importante es que hemos comenzado a dar pasos para construir una relación de nuevo tipo, como la que nunca ha existido entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos. Destruir un puente es fácil y requiere poco tiempo. Reconstruirlo sólidamente es una tarea de mucho más y larga, es mucho más larga y difícil. Después de 4 intentos fallidos, en una muestra de voluntad y perseverancia, el 2 de septiembre del 2013, la nadadora estadounidense Diana Nayat logró cruzar a nado el estrecho de la Florida sin jaula ante tiburones. Para esa hazaña de vencer la distancia que separa geográficamente a nuestros países, o por esa hazaña, el 30 de agosto del 2014, bajo los acordes de los signos nacionales de Cuba y los Estados Unidos, fue condecorada con la Orden al Mérito Deportivo otorgado por el Consejo de Estado cubano. Esta proeza contiene un fuerte mensaje. Debería servirnos de ejemplo para las relaciones bilaterales, ya que confirma que si ella pudo, entonces nosotros también podremos. Le reitero al presidente Obama nuestro agradecimiento por su visita y la voluntad del gobierno de Cuba de seguir avanzando en los próximos meses por el bien de nuestros pueblos y países. Muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes. President Castro, to you, the Cuban government, and the Cuban people, thank you for the welcome that you've extended to me, to my family, and to my delegation. For more than half a century, the sight of a U.S. president here in Havana would have been unimaginable. But this is a new day. Es un nuevo día between our two countries. With your indulgence, Mr. President, I want to go just briefly off topic because during this weekend I received news that one of our outstanding United States Armed Service members, Marine Staff Sergeant Louis F. Cardin of Temecula, California, was killed in northern Iraq as we assisted the Iraqi government in dealing with ISIL, the terrorist organization there. And I just wanted to give my thoughts and prayers to the family there and those who've been injured. It's a reminder that even as we embark on this historic visit, there are U.S. armed service members who are sacrificing each and every day on behalf of our freedom and our safety. So I'm grateful to them. And my wife Michelle and I have brought our daughters. And by the way, they don't always want to go with us. They're teenagers now. They have friends at home and they have things to do, but they wanted to come to Cuba because they understood and we wanted to show them the beauty of Cuba and its people. We were moved by the Cubans who received us yesterday, smiling and waving as we drove in from the airport. We were grateful for the opportunity to experience old Havana and some excellent Cuban food. Our visit to the cathedral was a reminder of the values that we share, the deep faith that sustains so many Cubans and Americans, and it also gave me an opportunity to express my gratitude to Cardinal Ortega, who, along with His Holiness Pope Francis, did so much to support the improved relations between our governments. This morning, I was honored to pay tribute to Jose Marti, not only his role in Cuban independence, but the profound words that he wrote and spoke in support of liberty and freedom everywhere. I bring with me the greetings and the friendship of the American people. In fact, I'm joined on this trip by nearly 40 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans. This is the largest such delegation of my presidency, and it indicates the excitement and interest in America about the process that we've undertaken. These members of Congress recognize that our new relationship with the Cuban people is in the interest of both nations. I'm also joined by some of America's top business leaders and entrepreneurs because we're ready to pursue more commercial ties which create jobs and opportunity for Cubans and Americans alike. And I'm especially pleased that I'm joined on this trip by so many Cuban Americans. For them and for the more than 2 million proud Cuban Americans across the United States, this is a moment filled with great emotion. Ever since we made it easier to travel between our countries, more Cuban Americans are coming home. And for many, this is a time of new hope for the future. So, President Castro, I want to thank you for the courtesy and the spirit of openness that you've shown during our talks. At our meeting in Panama last year, you said that we're willing to discuss every issue and everything's on the table. So with your understanding, my statement will be a little longer than usual. President Castro always jokes with me about how long Castro brother speeches can be, but I'm going to actually go a little longer than you probably today, with your indulgence. We have a half a century of work to catch up on. Our growing engagement with Cuba is guided by one overarching goal: advancing the mutual interest of our two countries, including improving the lives of our people, both Cubans and Americans. That's why I'm here. I've said consistently, after more than 5 very difficult decades, the relationship between our governments will not be transformed overnight. We continue, as President Castro indicated, to have some very serious differences. including on democracy and human rights. And President Castro and I have had very frank and candid conversations on these subjects. The United States recognizes progress that Cuba has made as a nation, its enormous achievements in education and in healthcare. And perhaps most importantly, I affirm that Cuba's destiny will not be decided by the United States or any other nation. Cuba is sovereign and rightly has great pride, and the future of Cuba will be decided by Cubans, not by anybody else. At the same time, as we do wherever we go around the world, I made it clear that the United States will continue to speak up on behalf of democracy, including the right of the Cuban people to decide their own future. We'll speak out on behalf of universal human rights, including freedom of speech and assembly and religion. Indeed, I look forward to meeting with and hearing from Cuban civil society leaders tomorrow. But as you heard, President Castro has also addressed what he views as shortcomings in the United States around basic needs for people and poverty and inequality and race relations. And we welcome that constructive dialogue as well, because we believe that when we share our deepest beliefs and ideas with an attitude of mutual respect, that we can both learn and make the lives of our people better. Now, part of normalizing relations means that we discuss these differences directly. So I'm very pleased that we've agreed to hold our next U.S.-Cuba human rights dialogue here in Havana this year. And both of our countries will welcome visits by independent United Nations experts as we combat human trafficking, which we agree is a profound violation of human rights. Even as we discuss these differences, we share a belief that we can continue to make progress in those areas that we have in common. President Castro, you said in Panama that we might disagree on something today on which we would agree tomorrow. And that's certainly been the case over the past 15 months and the days leading up to this visit. And today I can report that we continue to move forward on many fronts when it comes to normalizing relations. We're moving ahead with more opportunities for Americans to travel to Cuba and interact with the Cuban people. Over the past year, the number of Americans coming here has surged. Last week, we gave approval for individual Americans to come here for educational travel. U.S. airlines will begin direct commercial flights this year. With last week's port security announcement, we've removed the last major hurdle to resuming cruises and ferry service, all of which will mean even more Americans visiting Cuba in the years ahead and appreciating the incredible history and culture of the Cuban people. We're moving ahead with more trade. With only 90 miles between us, we're natural trading partners. Other steps we took last week, allowing the U.S. dollar to be used more widely with Cuba, giving Cubans more access to the dollar in international transactions, and allowing Cubans in the U.S. to earn salaries. These things will do more to create opportunities for trade and joint ventures. We welcome Cuba's important announcement that it plans to end the 10% penalty on dollar conversions here, which will open the door to more travel and more commerce. And these steps show that we're opening up to one another. With this visit, we've agreed to deepen our cooperation on agriculture to support our farmers and our ranchers. This afternoon, I'll highlight some of the new commercial deals being announced by major U.S. companies. And just as I continue to call on Congress to lift the trade embargo, I discussed with President Castro the steps we urge Cuba to take to show that it's ready to do more business, which includes allowing more joint ventures and allowing foreign companies to hire Cubans directly. We're moving ahead with our efforts to help connect more Cubans to the internet and the global economy. Under President Castro, Cuba's set a goal of bringing Cubans online, and we want to help. At this afternoon's entrepreneurship event, I'll discuss additional steps we're taking to help more Cubans learn, innovate, and do business online, because in the 21st century, countries cannot be successful unless their citizens have access to the internet. We're moving ahead with more educational exchanges. Thanks to the generous support of the Cuban American community, I can announce that my 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative will offer new opportunities for university students to study abroad, more Americans at Cuban schools and more Cubans at U.S. schools. And going forward, educational grants and scholarships will be available to Cuban students. And in partnership with the Cuban government, we'll offer more English language training for Cuban teachers, both in Cuba and online. Even as Cubans prepare for the arrival of the Rolling Stones, we're moving ahead with more events and exchanges that bring Cubans and Americans together as well. We all look forward to tomorrow's matchup between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Cuban national team. More broadly, we're moving ahead with partnerships in health, science, and the environment. Just as Cubans and American medical teams have worked together in Haiti against cholera and in West Africa against Ebola, and I want to give a special commendation to Cuban doctors who volunteered and took on some very tough assignments to save lives in West Africa in partnership with us and other nations. We very much appreciate the work that they did. Our medical professionals will now collaborate in new areas, preventing the spread of viruses like Zika and leading new research into cancer vaccines. Our governments will also work together to protect the beautiful waters of this region that we share. And as two countries threatened by climate change, I believe we can work together to protect communities and our low-lying coasts. And we're inviting Cuba to join us and our Caribbean and Central American partners at this spring's Regional Energy Summit in Washington. And finally, we're moving ahead with our closer cooperation on regional security. We're working to deepen our law enforcement coordination, especially against narco-traffickers that threaten both of our peoples. I want to thank President Castro and the Cuban government for hosting peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC, and we remain optimistic that Colombians can achieve a lasting and just peace. And although we did not have an extensive discussion of Venezuela, we did touch on the subject, and I believe that the whole region has an interest in a country that is addressing its economic challenges, is responsive to the aspirations of its people, and is a source of stability in the region. That is, I believe, an interest that we should all share. So again, President Castro, I want to thank you for welcoming me. I think it's fair to say that the United States and Cuba are now engaged across more areas than any time during my lifetime. And with every passing day, more Americans are coming to Cuba, more U.S. businesses and schools and faith groups are working to forge new partnerships with the Cuban people. More Cubans are benefiting from the opportunities that this travel and trade bring. As you indicated, the road ahead will not be easy. Fortunately, we don't have to swim with sharks in order to achieve the goals that you and I have set forth. As you say here in Cuba, echar para delante. Despite the difficulties, we will continue to move forward. We're focused on the future, and I'm absolutely confident that if we stay on this course, we can deliver a better and brighter future for both the Cuban people and the American people. So, muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Pasamos ahora a una breve sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Ruego a los periodistas identificarse y hacer uso de los micrófonos ubicados en la sala. Una primera pregunta, el presidente Barack Obama. Sí.
First question, Jim Costa.
Gracias, President Castro, para su hospitalidad en La Habana. And thank you, Mr. President. In your meeting with President Castro, what words did you use to urge him to pursue democratic reforms and expand human rights here in Cuba? Will you invite President Castro to the White House? We know he's been to New York. And why did you not meet with Fidel Castro? And President Castro, mi padre es cubano. Él se fue para los Estados Unidos cuando era joven. My father's Cuban. He left for the United States when he was young. Ve una dirección nueva y democrática para su país. do you see a new and democratic direction for your country? Y, por favor, señor, ¿por qué tiene prisioneros políticos cubanos? Why do you have Cuban political prisoners? ¿Y por qué no los suelta? Y, por favor, una pregunta más. ¿A quién prefiere? Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? Gracias.
As I think we both indicated, we had a very frank conversation around issues of democracy and human rights. Our starting point is that we have two different systems of government, two different economies, and we have decades of profound differences, both bilaterally and internationally. What I have said to President Castro is that we are moving forward and not looking backwards, that we don't view Cuba as a threat to the United States. I hope that my visit here indicates the degree to which we're setting a new chapter in Cuban-American relations. But as is true with countries around the world where we have normalized relations, we will continue to stand up for basic principles that we believe in. America believes in democracy. We believe that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion are not just American values, but are universal values. They may not express themselves exactly in the same way in every country. They may not be enshrined in the founding documents or constitutions of every country the same way or protected legally in exactly the same ways, but the impulse, the human impulse towards freedom, the freedom that Jose Marti talked about, we think is a universal longing. President Castro, I think, has pointed out that in his view, making sure that everybody's getting a decent education or health care, has basic security in old age, that those things are human rights as well. I personally would not disagree with that. But it doesn't detract from some of these other concerns. And the goal of the human rights dialogue is not for the United States to dictate to Cuba how they should govern themselves, but to make sure that we are having a frank and candid conversation around this issue, and hopefully that we can learn from each other. It does not mean that it has to be the only issue we talk about. Economics, health, scientific exchanges, international cooperation on issues of regional as well as global import are also important. But this is something that we are going to stay on. And I actually welcome President Castro commenting on some of the areas where he feels that we're falling short, because I think we should not be immune or afraid of criticism or discussion as well. Here's the one thing I do know, is that when I talk to Cuban Americans, and Jim, you're second generation, and so I think I speak not for you directly, but for many that I talk to around the United States. I think there's enormous hope that there can be reconciliation, and the bridge that President Castro discussed can be built between the Cuban American community and Cubans here. There are family ties and cultural ties that are so strong, and I think everyone would benefit from those ties being reestablished. One of the impediments to strengthening those ties is these disagreements around human rights and democracy. And to the extent that we can have a good conversation about that and to actually make progress, that I think will allow us to see the full flowering of a relationship that is possible. In the absence of that, I think it will continue to be a very powerful irritant. And you know, this is not unique to U.S.-Cuban relations. It's one that, as you know, I have conversations with when we go to bilateral meetings with some of our very close allies, as well as countries that we don't have as close of a relationship to. But I think it is something that that matters. And I've met with people who've been subject to arbitrary detention, and that's something that I generally have to speak out on because I hear from them directly and I know what it means for them. Go ahead. Excuse me.
Yeah?
Yeah, what?
Estaba preguntando si se dirigió a mí porque las primeras palabras no le entendí. Me pareció oír que habló de presos humanos.
No, I think the second one was addressed to you.
Ah, preso.
And Trump and Hillary.
¿A quién? ¿A él o a mí?
Para él, para su, señor presidente Castro.
¿Qué dijo de los presos políticos? ¿Qué pregunta concreta hizo de los presos políticos?
Sí, sí.
Si hay presos políticos. Preguntó si hay presos políticos.
Su país tiene prisioneros políticos cubanos.
Está bien, es la única que
no
te voy a
suelta?
permitir. Dame la lista ahora mismo de los presos políticos para soltarlo. Menciónala ahora. ¿Qué preso político? Dime el nombre o los nombres. O cuando concluya la reunión me da una lista con los presos. Y si hay esos presos políticos, antes de que llegue la noche van a estar sueltos. Ya.
Una
Otra
pregunta.
¿Y Donald Trump o Hillary Clinton, presidente Castro?
Una pregunta al presidente Raúl. Boris.
Saludos para el presidente Obama y para el
Yo
presidente.
todavía no puedo votar en los Estados Unidos. ¿Cómo?
Una pregunta para el presidente Raúl Castro, Boris Fuentes, de la televisión cubana. Presidente Raúl Castro, usted ha dicho en reiteradas ocasiones, y hoy lo ha repetido una vez más aquí, debemos aprender a convivir civilizadamente con nuestras diferencias. ¿Podría usted ampliarnos ese concepto en este momento histórico que está viviendo Cuba? Y también, de paso, una pregunta pequeña para el presidente Barack Obama. Presidente Obama, ¿podría el gobierno de Estados Unidos dar mayores pasos para eliminar el bloqueo de Estados Unidos durante su gobierno y no tendría que vivir una generación más de cubanos bajo este bloqueo económico y financiero contra Cuba?
Para mí fue la primera. O sea, repite tu pregunta que no pudo ir bien. Entonces.
Usted ha dicho en reiteradas ocasiones, hoy lo ha repetido otra vez, debemos aprender a convivir civilizadamente con nuestras diferencias.
Bien, el propio presidente Obama se ha estado refiriéndose a eso. Hemos dado los primeros pasos, bastante para ser los primeros, y debemos continuar dando esos pasos. Y estoy seguro de que lograremos convivir pacíficamente en un ambiente de colaboración mutua, como ya lo estamos haciendo en algunos aspectos, en beneficio de ambos países, en beneficio de otros países, como ya lo hemos hecho modestamente en Haití, cuando el cólera, y en África con el ébola, como él se refirió, y que es el futuro de la humanidad si queremos salvar la especie, aunque el agua siga creciendo y la isla se reduzca. Sí. Muchas preguntas para mí. Yo creo que las preguntas hay que hacerse al presidente Obama.
Presidente Obama, por favor.
Ahí está el regulador.
I've got one more. So we have administratively already made a number of modifications on the embargo. I referred to a number of them in my opening statement. And we've actually been fairly aggressive in exercising as much flexibility as we can, given that the law putting the embargo in place has not been repealed by Congress. There may be some technical aspects of the embargo that we can still make adjustments on, depending on problems as they arise. So, for example, the issue around the dollar and the need to make modifications in terms of how the embargo was implemented to encourage rather than discourage reforms that the Cuban government itself is willing to engage in and to facilitate greater trade and commerce. That is something that grew out of the dialogue between our governments, and we have made appropriate adjustments to it. It will take some time for commercial banks to understand the new rules, but we actually think that this is an area where we can improve current circumstances. But I'll be honest with you that the list of things that we can do administratively is growing shorter, and the bulk of changes that have to be made with respect to the embargo are now going to rely on Congress making changes. I've been very clear about the interest in getting that done before I leave. Frankly, Congress is not as productive as I would like during presidential election years. But the fact that we have such a large congressional delegation with Democrats and Republicans with us is an indication that there is growing interest inside of Congress for lifting the embargo. As I just indicated in my earlier answer, how quickly that happens will in part depend on whether we can bridge some of our differences around human rights issues, and that's why the dialogue, I think, is so important. It sends a signal that at least there's engagement between the two countries on these matters. Okay. Now, I promised the President I would take one more question. Andrea Mitchell of NBC. Andrea, if you can get the mic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do you feel after your meetings today that you have made enough progress to even accelerate the pace, and that the Cuban government is able to move quickly enough so that the changes that you have made through these technical adjustments to the embargo will be permanent, cannot be reversed by the next president? And what advice have you given to President Castro about the ability of having the blockade, the embargo lifted? Because he has said again today, this is a continuous issue which is blocking progress from their standpoint. And you said the conversations about human rights were frank and candid, and that you want to move forward. But even as you were arriving, there were dramatic arrests of peaceful protests, the ladies in white. What signal does that send? Can you have civilized coexistence at the same time you have such profound disagreements about the very definitions of what human rights means, as President Castro expressed today? And for President Castro, for many of us, it's remarkable to hear you speak about all of these subjects. Could you tell us what you see in the future? President Obama has 9 months remaining you have said you would be stepping down in 2018. What is the future of our two countries, given the different definitions and the different interpretations of profound issues like democracy and human rights? Thank you.
Well, Andrea, the embargo is going to end. When? I can't be entirely sure, but I believe it will end, and the path that we're on will continue beyond my administration. The reason is logic. The reason is that what we did for 50 years did not serve our interests or the interests of the Cuban people. And as I said when we made the announcement about normalization of relations, if you keep on doing something over and over again for 50 years and it doesn't work, it might make sense to try something new. And that's what we've done. And the fact that there has been strong support, not just inside of Congress, not just among the American people, but also among the Cuban people, indicates that this is a process that should and will continue. Having said that, lifting the embargo requires the votes of a majority in Congress and maybe even more than a majority in the Senate. And as I indicated to President Castro, two things I think will help accelerate the pace of bringing the embargo to an end. The first is, to the degree that we can take advantage of the existing changes that we've already made and we see progress, that will help to validate this change in policy. So, for example, we have said that it is no longer a restriction on U.S. companies to invest in helping to build internet and broadband infrastructure inside of Cuba. It is not against U.S. law, as it's been interpreted by the administration. If we start seeing those kinds of commercial deals taking place, and Cubans are benefiting from greater access to the internet, and when I go to the entrepreneurship meeting later this afternoon, I understand that we're going to meet some young Cubans who are already getting trained and are facile and using the internet and interested in startups. That builds a constituency for ending the embargo. If we build on the work that we're doing in agriculture, and you start seeing more U.S. farmers interacting with Cuban farmers, and there's more exports and imports, that builds a constituency, and the possibility of ending the embargo increases. So hopefully taking advantage of what we've already done will help. And the second area, which we've already discussed extensively, is the issue of human rights. People are still concerned about that inside of Cuba. Now, keep in mind, I've got fierce disagreements with the Chinese around human rights. I'll be going to Vietnam later this year. I have deep disagreements with them as well. You know, when we first visited Burma, people questioned whether we should be traveling there because of long-standing human rights violations in our view. And the approach that I've taken has been that if I engage, frankly, clearly, stating what our beliefs are, but also being clear that we can't force change on any particular country. Ultimately, it has to come from within. Then that is going to be a more useful strategy than the same kinds of rigid disengagement that for 50 years did nothing. I guess ultimately what this comes down to, Andreas, I have faith in people. I think that if you meet Cubans here and Cubans meet Americans and they're meeting and talking and interacting and doing business together and going to school together and learning from each other, then they'll recognize people are people. And in that context, I believe that change will occur.
President Castro.
Okay, now I'm done, but Senor Presidente, I think Andrea had a question for you just about your vision. It's up to you. He did say he was only going to take one question. I was going to take two, but I leave it up to you if you want to address that question.
Por favor.
Andrea's she's one of our most esteemed journalists in America, and I'm sure she'd appreciate just a short, brief answer.
Andrea,
Mr. President,
sí, cómo no. El otro día le hizo una pregunta al canciller nuestro. Andrea. Le están preguntando a usted, pero tenemos que concluir. Hay un programa. Yo sé que si me quedo aquí hacen 500 preguntas. Yo dije que iba a contestar una. Voy a contestar 1:30. Ya el presidente Obama me ayudó con la respuesta. Andrea, es usted. Bien, Andrea. Yo leí algo aquí de lo que pienso de los derechos humanos, pero ahora soy yo el que le voy a hacer una pregunta a usted. En las instituciones ya reconocido hay 40 de 60 sí. Instrumentos internacionales, etcétera. ¿Cuántos países, Andrea, del mundo cumplen los 61 derechos humanos? Eso es señalado ahí. Y civiles, en su conjunto. ¿Qué país los cumple todos? ¿Lo sabe usted? Yo sí. Ninguno. Unos cumplen unos, otros cumplen otros. Y entre esos estamos nosotros. De esos mencionados 61 son. Cuba cumple 47. Habrá otros que cumplan más y muchos que cumplen menos. No se puede politizar el tema de los derechos humanos. Eso no es correcto. Si se persigue con esos fines, vamos a seguir con lo mismo. Por ejemplo, para Cuba, que no los cumple todos, el derecho a la salud. ¿Usted quiere un derecho más sagrado que el derecho a la salud? Que no se mueran millones y millones de niños por falta de una simple vacuna, por cualquier medicina. Por ejemplo, ¿usted está de acuerdo con el derecho a la enseñanza gratuita para todos los nacidos en cualquier país? Creo que hay muchos países que no consideran eso un derecho humano. En Cuba, empezando que todos los niños nacen en hospital y ese mismo primer día son inscritos. Porque cuando las madres están en un estado avanzado de su embarazo, se les conduce a los hospitales muchos días antes, o en algunas casas o locales adjuntos, muchos días antes del parto, para que todos nazcan en hospitales, no importa en qué isla o montaña viva, ni sus condiciones económicas. Tenemos también otros muchos derechos. Derecho a la salud, derecho a la enseñanza. Usted considera, por ejemplo, el último ejemplo que le voy a sacar, o le voy a exponer. ¿Usted cree que por un trabajo igual un hombre gane más que una mujer solo por ser mujer? Bueno, pues en Cuba la mujer gana igual que el hombre si hace igual trabajo. Le puedo enumerar decenas y cientos. Es decir, que no se puede estar utilizando ese argumento, pienso yo, en la confrontación política, que no es justo, no es correcto. No quiero decir que no es honesto, eso forma parte de las confrontaciones. Vamos a trabajar para que todos podamos cumplir todos los derechos humanos. Eso es así. Igual que hablar de precios. Yo voy a terminar porque fue un compromiso de terminar puntual. No es correcto por preguntarnos por presos políticos. Dígame el nombre del preso político. Y ya.
Hemos concluido. Muchas gracias a todos por la participación.
I want to begin by thanking the people of Washington, D.C. for hosting us, especially for putting up with more than 50 motorcades. And I will make one promise to the people of this city: I will not hold another one of these summits in another 6 years. I want to thank everyone who participated in our meetings, more than 50 leaders from every region of the world and key international organizations. As at our previous summits, we didn't just come here to talk, but we came here to act. I know that the very technical nature of nuclear security doesn't always make for flashy headlines, but over the past 6 years, we have made significant, meaningful progress in securing the world's nuclear materials so that it never falls into the hands of terrorists. And I want to take a few moments to step back and lay out exactly what we have accomplished. Together, we have removed the world's most deadly materials from nuclear facilities around the world. With Japan's announcement today, we've now removed or secured all the highly enriched uranium and plutonium from more than 50 facilities in 30 countries, more than 3.8 tons, which is more than enough to create 150 nuclear weapons. That's material that will never fall into the hands of terrorists. 14 nations and Taiwan, countries as diverse as Argentina and Chile to Libya and Turkey to Serbia and Vietnam, have now rid themselves entirely of highly enriched uranium and plutonium. In particular, I want to point out again that successfully removing all of Ukraine's highly enriched uranium 4 years ago meant that the very difficult situation in Ukraine over the past 2 years was not made even more dangerous by the presence of these materials. As of today, South America, an entire continent, is completely free of these dangerous materials. When Poland completes its removal this year, Central Europe will be free of them as well. When Indonesia completes its work this year, so will all of Southeast Asia. In other words, as terrorists and criminal gangs and arms merchants look around for deadly ingredients for a nuclear device, vast regions of the world are now off limits, and that is a remarkable achievement. We've made important progress in the United States as well. In addition to new steps I announced this morning, we've improved nuclear security and training. We've consolidated nuclear materials at fewer facilities, eliminated some 138 tons of our surplus highly enriched uranium, which would be enough for 5,500 nuclear weapons. Working with Russia, we're on track to eliminate enough Russian highly enriched uranium for about 20,000 nuclear weapons, which we are converting to electricity here in the United States. More specifically, as a result of these summits, every single one of the more than 50 nations represented here have taken concrete steps to enhance security at their nuclear facilities and storage sites, and that includes improved physical security, stronger regulations, abiding by international guidelines, greater transparency, and that includes international peer reviews. 15 new centers have been created around the world to promote nuclear security technologies and training to share best practices. And as part of our work today, we agreed to keep strengthening our nuclear facilities' defenses against cyber attacks. We bolstered international efforts to disrupt nuclear smuggling. The Proliferation Security Initiative has grown to more than 100 nations, including regular exercises to improve our collective ability to interdict shipments. The United States and 36 partner countries have worked to install radiation detection equipment at more than 300 international border crossings, airports, and ports, and we are developing new mobile detection systems as well. And finally, as I noted this morning, we've strengthened the treaties and international partnerships that are a foundation for so many of our efforts. So again, we have made significant progress, and everyone involved in this work, especially our teams who have worked tirelessly for years, can take enormous pride in our achievements. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, our work is by no means finished. There's still a great deal of nuclear and radioactive material around the world that needs to be secured. Global stocks of plutonium are growing. Nuclear arsenals are expanding in some countries with more small tactical nuclear weapons, which could be at greater risk of theft. And as a consequence, one of the central goals of this summit was how do we build on the work that has been done so that we have an international architecture that can continue the efforts, even though this is the last formal Leaders Summit. So even as this is the last of those leader-level summits, today we agreed to maintain a strong architecture, including through the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Interpol, to carry on this work and to provide the resources and technical support that is needed to continue this mission. And we are creating a new nuclear security contact group, senior-level experts from more than 30 of our countries who will meet regularly to preserve the networks of cooperation we've built, to institutionalize this work, and to keep driving progress for years to come. At our session on ISIL this afternoon, there was widespread agreement that defeating terrorist groups like ISIL requires more information sharing. Everybody understands the urgency in the wake of what's happened in Brussels and Turkey, Pakistan, and so many other countries around the world. As a consequence, our Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, is continuing to engage with intelligence leaders from a number of our European partners on deepening our cooperation. And today I invited all the nations represented at this summit to join a broader discussion among our intelligence and security services on how we can improve information sharing within and among our nations to prevent all manner of terrorist attacks, especially those that might involve weapons of mass destruction. In closing, I just want to say that preventing nuclear terrorism is one part of the broader agenda that I outlined 7 years ago in Prague, stopping the spread of nuclear weapons and seeking a world without them. In recent days, there's been no shortage of analysis on whether we've achieved our vision, and I'm the first to acknowledge the great deal of work that remains, from negotiating further reductions with Russia to dealing with North Korea's nuclear program. As I indicated in Prague, realizing our vision will not happen quickly, and it perhaps will not happen in my lifetime. But we've begun. The United States and Russian nuclear arsenals are on track to be the lowest that they have been in 6 decades. I've reduced the number and role of nuclear weapons in our nuclear security strategy. In a historic deal, we've prevented the spread of nuclear weapons to Iran. An international fuel bank is being built to promote civil nuclear cooperation. So I'm extremely proud of our record across the board, and we're going to keep pushing forward wherever we can, as I hope future administrations do, to bring us closer to the day when these nuclear dangers no longer hang over the heads of our children and our grandchildren. With that, let me take a few questions, and I'm going to start with Roberta Rampton of Reuters.
Thank you. I want to ask about Iran. And 3 weeks ago, Iran's supreme leader complained that his country has not been getting actual business deals since the nuclear agreement. And non-U.S. companies are saying that it's very hard or sometimes impossible to do much business with Iran without, at some point, accessing the U.S. financial system to do U.S. dollar-denominated transactions. So my question is, are you considering allowing such transactions? And if so, is that not a betrayal of your assurances that most U.S. sanctions would stay in place?
That's not actually the approach that we're taking. Let me say broadly that so long as Iran is carrying out its end of the bargain, we think it's important for the world community to carry out our end of the bargain. They have, in fact, based on the presentations that were made by the IAEA this morning to the P5+1, have in fact followed the implementation steps that were laid out. And as a consequence, sanctions related to their nuclear program have been brought down. Part of the challenge that they face is that companies haven't been doing business there for a long time, and they need to get comfortable with the prospects of this deal holding. One of the things that Secretary Liu and his counterparts within the P5+1 and elsewhere are going to be doing is providing clarity to businesses about what transactions are in fact allowed. And it's going to take time over the next several months for companies and their legal departments to feel confident that in fact there may not be risks of liability if they do business with Iran. And so some of the concerns that Iran has expressed, we are going to work with them to address. It is not necessary that we take the approach of them going through dollar-denominated transactions. It is possible for them to work through European financial institutions as well. But there is going to need to be continued clarification provided to businesses in order for deal flows to begin. Now, what I would say is also important is Iran's own behavior in generating confidence that Iran's a safe place to do business. In a deal like this, my first priority, my first concern was making sure that we got their nuclear program stopped and material that they already had that would give them a very short breakout capacity that was shipped out. That has happened. And I always said that I could not promise that Iran would take advantage of this opportunity in this window to re-enter the international community. Iran so far has followed the letter of the agreement, but the spirit of the agreement involves Iran also sending signals to the world community and businesses that it is not going to be engaging in a range of provocative actions that might scare business off. When they launch ballistic missiles with slogans calling for the destruction of Israel, that makes businesses nervous. There is some geopolitical risk that is heightened when they see that taking place. If Iran continues to ship missiles to Hezbollah, that gets businesses nervous. And so part of what I hope happens is we have a responsibility to provide clarity about the rules that govern so that Iran can in fact benefit, the Iranian people can benefit from an improved economic situation. But Iran has to understand what every country in the world understands, which is businesses want to go where they feel safe, where they don't see massive controversy, where they can be confident that transactions are going to operate normally. And that's an adjustment that Iran's going to have to make as well. And frankly, within Iran, I suspect there are different views in the same way that there are hardliners here in the United States who, even after we certify that this deal is working, even after our intelligence teams, Israeli intelligence teams say this has been a game changer, are still opposed to the deal on principle. There are hardliners inside of Iran who don't want to see Iran open itself up to the broader world community and are doing things to potentially undermine the deal. And so those forces that seek the benefits of the deal, not just in narrow terms, but more broadly, we want to make sure that over time, they're in a position to realize those benefits. Okay. David Nakamura.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks, you just finished a working session with 50 world leaders about combating terrorism and groups like the Islamic State. And I wanted to ask you specifically about one of the strategies, prime strategies your administration is using in that effort. In the past several weeks, your administration has killed well over 200 people in airstrikes in Somalia, Libya, and Yemen, according to the Department of Defense. How can you be certain that all of the people killed pose an imminent threat to the United States? And why is the United States now killing scores of people at a time rather than eliminating individuals in very targeted strikes? Thank you.
You know, we have constructed a fairly rigid and vigorous set of criteria for us evaluating the intelligence that we receive about ISIL, where it might be operating, where al-Qaeda is operating. These guidelines involve a whole range of agencies consulting extensively and are then checked, double-checked, triple-checked before kinetic actions are taken. And for the most part, our actions are directed at high-value targets in the countries that you just described, outside of the theater of Iraq and Syria. In some cases, what we're seeing are camps that, after long periods of monitoring, becomes clear are involved in and directing plots that could do the United States harm, or are supporting ISIL activities or al-Qaeda activities elsewhere in the world. So if after a long period of observation we are seeing that, in fact, explosive materials are being loaded onto trucks and individuals are engaging in training in small arms, and there are some of those individuals who are identified as couriers for ISIL or al-Qaeda, then based on those evaluations, a strike will be taken. But what we have been very cautious about is making sure that we are not taking strikes in situations where, for example, we think there's the presence of women or children, or if it is in a normally populated area. And, you know, recently we laid out the criteria by which we're making these decisions. We declassified many elements of this. We are going to be putting forward and trying to institutionalize on a regular basis how we make these evaluations and these analyses. I think, you know, in terms of the broader debate that's taken place, David, I think there's been in the past legitimate criticism that the architecture, the legal architecture around the use of drone strikes or other kinetic strikes wasn't as precise as it should have been, and there's no doubt that civilians were killed that shouldn't have been. I think that over the last several years, we have worked very hard to avoid and prevent those kinds of tragedies from taking place. In situations of war, we have to take responsibility when we're not acting appropriately, or where we've just made mistakes, even with the best of intentions. And that's what we're going to continue to try to do. And what I can say with great confidence is that our operating procedures are as rigorous as they have ever been, and that there is a constant evaluation of precisely what we do. Carol Lee.
Thank you, Mr. President. You've spent 7 years now working on nonproliferation issues, and you said in your opening remarks that you hope the future administrations do the same and make it a priority. This week, one of the Republican frontrunner to replace you said that perhaps South Korea and Japan should have nuclear weapons and wouldn't rule out using nuclear weapons in Europe. Did that come up at this summit? And just generally, what message does it send when a major party candidate is articulating such a reversal in U.S. foreign policy? And also, who did you vote for in the Democratic primary?
Well, first of all, it's a secret ballot, isn't it? Okay. All right. No, I'm not going to tell you now. What the statements you mentioned tell us? They tell us that the person who made the statements doesn't know much about foreign policy or nuclear policy or the Korean Peninsula or the world generally. It came up on the sidelines. I've said before that, people pay attention to American elections. What we do is really important to the rest of the world. Even in those countries that are used to a carnival atmosphere in their own politics, want sobriety and clarity when it comes to U.S. elections, because they understand the President of the United States needs to know what's going on around the world and has to put in place the kinds of policies that lead not only to our security and prosperity, but will have an impact on everybody else's security and prosperity. Our alliance with Japan and the Republic of Korea is one of the foundations, one of the cornerstones of our presence in the Asia-Pacific region. It has underwritten the peace and prosperity of that region. It has been an enormous boon to American commerce and American influence, and it has prevented the possibilities of a nuclear escalation and conflict between countries that in the past and throughout history have been engaged in hugely destructive conflicts and controversies. So you don't mess with that. It is an investment that rests on the sacrifices that our men and women made back in World War II when they were fighting throughout the Pacific. It is because of their sacrifices and the wisdom that American foreign policymakers showed after World War II that we've been able to avoid catastrophe in those regions. And we don't want somebody in the Oval Office who doesn't recognize how important that is. Andrew Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yesterday you met with President Erdogan of Turkey hours after some fairly ugly scenes at the Brookings Institution. I was wondering, do you consider him an authoritarian?
Turkey is a NATO ally. It is an extraordinarily important partner in our fight against ISIL. It is a country with whom we have a long and strategic relationship with. And President Erdogan is someone who I've dealt with since I came into office. And in a whole range of areas, we've had a productive partnership. What is also true, and I have expressed this to him directly, so it's no secret that there are some trends within Turkey that I've been troubled with. I am a strong believer in freedom of the press. I'm a strong believer in freedom of religion. I am a strong believer in rule of law and democracy. And there is no doubt that President Erdogan has repeatedly been elected through a democratic process. But I think the approach that they've been taking towards the press is one that could lead Turkey down a path that would be very troubling. And we are going to continue to advise them and I've said to President Erdogan, remind him that he came into office with a promise of democracy, and Turkey has historically been a country in which deep Islamic faith has lived side by side with modernity and an increasing openness, and that's the legacy that he should pursue rather than a strategy that involves repression of information and shutting down democratic debate. Having said that, I want to emphasize the degree to which their cooperation has been critical on a whole range of international and regional issues, and will continue to be. And so, as is true with a lot of our friends and partners, we work with them, we cooperate with them, we are appreciative of their efforts, and there are going to be some differences. And where there are differences, we will say so. And that's what I've tried to do here. I'll take one last question. This young lady right there.
Thank you, President. Mr. President, what do you think?
Where are you from, by the way?
I am from Azerbaijan.
Okay.
How can Azerbaijan support in nuclear security issue?
Well, Azerbaijan, like many countries that participated, have already taken a number of steps, and each country has put forward a national action plan. There are some countries that had stockpiles of highly enriched uranium that they agreed to get rid of. There are other countries that have civilian nuclear facilities, but don't necessarily have the best security practices, and so they have adopted better security practices. There are countries that could potentially be transit points for the smuggling of nuclear materials, and so they've worked with us on border controls and detection. And because of Azerbaijan's location, it's a critical partner in this process. I should point out, by the way, that although the focus of these summits has been on securing nuclear materials and making sure they don't fall into the hands of terrorists, the relationships, the information sharing, the stitching together of domestic law enforcement, international law enforcement, intelligence, military agencies, both within countries and between countries. This set of relationships internationally will be useful not just for nuclear material, but it is useful in preventing terrorism generally. It's useful in identifying threats of chemical weapons or biological weapons. One of the clear messages coming out of this summit and our experiences over the last 7 years is an increasing awareness that some of the most important threats that we face are transnational threats. And so we are slowly developing a web of relationships around the world that allow us to match and keep up with the transnational organizations that all too often are involved in terrorist activity, criminal activity, human trafficking, a whole range of issues that can ultimately do our citizens harm. And seeing the strengthening of these institutions, I think, will be one of the most important legacies of this entire process. Mark Landler, since you had your hand up, I'll call on you one last question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask a question about nuclear policy. Through these past 7 years, when you've pushed to rid the world of nuclear materials and fissile material, the U.S. nuclear industry has actually worked to improve miniaturization of warheads. And while it's not developed new classes of cruise missiles or warheads, it's worked to improve the technology. And that's prompted some in China and Russia to say, well, gee, we need to keep up. Are you concerned that the technological advances in the United States have had the effect of sort of undermining some of the progress you've made on the prevention side?
I think it's a legitimate question, and I am concerned. Here's the balance that we've had to strike. We have a nuclear stockpile that we have to make sure is safe and make sure is reliable. And after the START treaty, the START II treaty that we entered into with Russia, we have brought down significantly the number of weapons that are active. But we also have to make sure that they're up to date, that their command and control systems that might have been developed a while ago are up to snuff given all the technology that has changed since that time. And we have to make sure that our deterrence continues to work. And so even as we've brought down the number of weapons that we have, I've wanted to make sure that what we do retain functions, that it is not subject to a cyber intrusion, that there's sufficient confidence in the system that we don't create destabilizing activity. My preference would be to bring down further our nuclear arsenal. And after we completed START II, I approached the Russians, our team approached the Russians in terms of looking at a next phase for arms reductions. Because Mr. Putin came into power or returned to his office as president, and because of the vision that he's been pursuing of emphasizing military might over development inside of Russia and diversifying the economy, we have not seen the kind of progress that I would have hoped for with Russia. The good news is that the possibilities of progress remain. We are abiding by START II. We're seeing implementation. And although we are not likely to see further reductions during my presidency, my hope is that we have built the mechanisms and systems of verification and so forth that will allow us to continue to reduce them in the future. We do have to guard against, in the interim, ramping up new and more deadly and more effective systems that end up leading to a whole new escalation of the arms race. And in our modernization plan, I've tried to strike the proper balance, making sure that the triad and our systems work properly, that they're effective, but also to make sure that we are leaving the door open to further reductions in the future. But one of the challenges that we're going to have here is that it is very difficult to see huge reductions in our nuclear arsenal unless the United States and Russia, as the two largest possessors of nuclear weapons, are prepared to lead the way. The other area where I think we need to see progress is Pakistan and India, that subcontinent, making sure that as they develop military doctrines, that they are not continually moving in the wrong direction. And we have to take a look at the Korean Peninsula because the DPRK, North Korea, is in a whole different category and poses the most immediate set of concerns for all of us, one that we are working internationally to focus on, and that's one of the reasons why we had the trilateral meeting with Japan and Korea, and it was a major topic of discussion with President Xi as well. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good weekend.